All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Anthony Monta. I'm the Assistant Director for Academics at the Nanovic Institute for European Studies here on campus. I've been told to please ask you to turn off all of your cell phones, your French horns, your tubas, your other band instruments. This is the first time I've ever seen somebody walk in with a horn. So if the movie is good, you can clap afterwards. Maybe a good blast would be good as well. As you all probably know, the Nanovic Institute here on campus runs an annual film series of European film. And typically each of those series is organized around a theme that runs throughout the year. But this year presented us, after several years of themes, with an opportunity to scoop up some of the best of recent European film and show it as a set. But it also presented us with an opportunity to integrate some of those films with an opportunity from the French-American Cultural Exchange. The FACE organization, which is housed and is partnered with the cultural services of the French Embassy in New York. They provide grant funding for allowing a tournée festival of films to travel the United States and North America. They're also partnered with the French Ministry of Culture and sponsored, I have to say, by the Florence Gould Foundation, the Grand Marnier Foundation, and Highbrow Entertainment. So you're in exceedingly good company. With an application written by Dr. Catherine Perry, who is here tonight, and supported by the Nanovic Institute, Notre Dame was awarded the grant. So this is the opening film in the Tournée Festival of French Films at Notre Dame. There are 5 films. They're all going to be shown in the next 30 days in October. They're all wonderful films. And I want to express my thanks on behalf of everyone at the Institute to Catherine Perry, to Aaron Mannion Park, who's a professor in FTT, to Ted Barron here at DPAC, Dawn Crafton, Jean-Francois Fournier, and the Nanovic Institute Film Committee. It's delightful and humbling, I have to say, to work with people of this caliber. So, to those of you in the audience, I want to encourage you to do the following. First, see all 5 films in the tournée this month, and see the examples of French New Wave films that Mr. Barron has put together next weekend, which includes classics by François Truffaut and Jean-Luc Godard. Please visit also our blog, which we've set up related to this tournée, to leave your comments and impressions about the film. Its address is blogsnd.edu/tournée, T-O-U-R-N-E-E-S. And stick around for question and answer tonight. Now, I'm very happy to say that to introduce tonight the person who will introduce Clapiche and his film, Dr. Jean Fallon, who is professor of French at Hollins University in Virginia. Dr. Fallon earned her MA and PhD from the University of Virginia, specializes in 16th century French poetry and prose. But the liberal arts college where she works, of course, has necessarily made her something of an all-rounder in the field. So she has expertise in a wide variety of things, including French film. Asked a few years ago to offer a course on French cinema, a subject that was entirely new to her, she threw herself onto her floor and during sabbatical and watched between, she estimates, 300 to 400 French films in that single year. And it's no coincidence, I have learned that she is also a superb long-distance runner. The author of 2 books, Voice and Vision in Ronsard's Les Sonnets pour Hélène, and His Story, Her Story, A Literary Mystery of Renaissance France. She's a true scholar, adventurer, and full of stories. And she's here tonight to talk to you about Cédric Clapiche, about whom she's writing a book-length study, and his place in French cinema. So, I can't think of anybody better to introduce his recent film from 2008, Paris, ladies and gentlemen, Jean Fallon.
Thank you. Can you hear me? It's fine? Okay. I'm really delighted to be here with you to present Cédric Clapiche's film Paris. I would like to thank Anthony Monta, Monica Caro, and Angela Cavalieri for their kind invitation and their many efforts in arranging all of the details of this trip. I wanted to tell you a little bit about how I came to be interested in Clapiche, but Anthony has already mentioned that I had studied French film during a sabbatical. And at the end of my time of watching 300 to 400 French films, I wrote a letter to Cédric Clapiche because I had been interested in his films. And I asked if I could just email some questions. And to my amazement, he called me and arranged to meet with me in Paris in 2006. And of course I went, and we had a wonderful conversation. And after that meeting, I've continued to study his films because I find that his work presents thoughtful areas to look at in terms of French society and European society. And also I think that his films contribute to new directions in French film overall. I don't know how familiar you are with Cédric Klapisch and his work, so I'll just give you a little background about him first before I speak about Paris. He's a French writer and filmmaker born in the Paris area in 1961. After studies in literature and humanities, he was then twice denied admission to what was then known as the IDHEC, or the Institute for Advanced Cinematography Studies in France. And he was rejected in part because of his interest in pursuing something different, especially taking some distance from the films of the Nouvelle Vague and their well-known and revered directors, Truffaut, Godard, or Romain. So, rejected by the French school, he went to Stanford for several months and then studied film at NYU for 2 years, where he made a number of short films. He was really grateful for that time, but he decided he would prefer to go back to France to make his career there. And once back in France, he threw himself into working on short films, including Ce qui me meut, which garnered several awards in 1990. He moved on to feature-length films and has now completed 9, as well as 2 documentaries. And he's right now finishing work on his 10th film, which should be out in early 2011. Klapisch is perhaps best known in the US for his L'Auberge Espagnole, The Spanish Apartment, a film that achieved near cult status about a young Frenchman studying in Barcelona, and its sequel, Les Poupées Russes, The Russian Dolls. Both L'Auberge Espagnole and Les Poupées Russes offer entertaining, largely comedic narratives, along with some thoughtful commentary about a united Europe and the broad European community. Paris appeared in theaters in 2008, and like all of Klapisch's films, it deals with the relationship between the individual and the group. In Paris, Klapisch sought to put together 2 styles of work that he has used in previous films, one more unstructured in tone and the second more polished. Let's take a minute just to see a little footage of Cédric Klapisch during the filming of Paris, so you can see what he looks like.
Aux angoisses que j'avais sur mes courts-métrages ou sur mon premier long-métrage ou sur ceux qu'on suivi, là par exemple c'est ultra difficile ce qu'on va faire dans la journée. Je me sens assez serein, c'est-à-dire qu'on va faire ce qu'on pourra, et donc du coup tout ce qui pourrait être de l'appréhension, je le gomme, j'en ai rien à foutre. Il n'y a plus de gêne, il n'y a plus de timidité, il n'y a plus de frein. J'ai l'impression que bizarrement, comme je recherche le plaisir, je sais que ça va être jouissif de faire ça, quoi. Et ben moi je m'y remets à travailler.
Okay, now you know what he looks like. And that's going to be important in a moment. In Paris, I think we can find what I consider signature Klapisch elements which appear in nearly all of his films. In each film, he always plays a small cameo role, or at least makes a very brief appearance. So you need to look for him now that you know what he looks like. Look for him in this film you're going to see. In each film, the wide-ranging soundtrack adds nuance to his themes. He employs many of the same actors again and again. In this film, you'll see Romain Duris acting in his 6th feature-length film, and Zinedine Souellem in his 9th by Klapisch. He always uses a dream or a fantasy scene to comment on reality. He almost always includes at least one dance sequence. He often uses windows, mirrors, or other reflections in his shots, and he has a penchant for framing images through grids or for breaking an image into many small pieces. And that filming technique of dividing an image into small parts works well to illustrate one of his main beliefs. Big stories are told through small pieces. Each individual offers his or her narrative to the whole, and then it's up to us to put the pieces together in a perspective that makes sense. In short, the group is made of the sum of its members, the whole is made of the sum of its parts, and if we focus on the small parts, as Klapisch enjoys doing, we find a larger, coherent whole. As Klapisch told me, and I'll paraphrase in English, "My job is to observe people. I try to be the witness to what is taking place around me." However, he added that he likes to represent conflicts and tensions to his public without necessarily offering a solution or even a preference for one viewpoint over another. He believes that every person contains within him or herself a variety of contradictions, and his films generally feature characters who display their contradictions and vulnerabilities in everyday or ordinary situations. Klapisch stresses how average he considers himself to be, and how much the commonplace presents areas of exploration for him to follow. Klapisch has stated that French films can combine both the auteur or art house elements that many associate with French and/or European films, and an entertaining or commercial aspect that sells to mainstream audiences. He has always believed that one can make popular films without imagining the spectators to be imbeciles. At the same time, he puts content and culture ahead of profit and protests letting popular taste and financial gain direct cultural development. The word ensemble is often used to describe some of his films because of their large casts and mosaic storylines. He is, in fact, devoted to the notion of plurality, passionate about diversity, pushed to include both popular culture and so-called highbrow notions in his work. He despairs what he calls the Harry Potterization of culture, whereby we don't notice how much reality television or other large, singular media events have overtaken our leisure time. He believes in making room for reading, opera, dance, theater, being on guard against conforming to the status quo. He makes movies which comment on his society, often including characters with differing opinions on immigration or gentrification, enjoying the mix of ideas that every community necessarily contains. He has stated that he enjoys conflict, enjoys exploring opposing viewpoints, believing that progress comes from keeping something of the old and adding something of the new. Paris is more sober than most of his other movies, and the notion of death hovers about the film. Klapisch points both to the concept that death can bring an increased appreciation for life, a desire to seize the day to the fullest, and to the notion that Paris is a city full of the haunts of her legendary writers, artists, and other historical figures. Paris, with its monuments paying homage to past glories, its catacombs, its ancient quarters, its cemeteries of luminary figures, is a city that can easily offer images of death, particularly in autumn and winter, side by side with lively modern spectacles of fashion, art, architecture, and theater. The French writers Balzac and Baudelaire are evoked by and in this film, but so too do I find that Klapisch may be channeling his inner Kieślowski, his inner Altman, his inner Woody Allen, as I find subtle and perhaps unconscious allusions to some of these directors' works. As Woody Allen features his love and knowledge of New York, Klapisch has used Paris not only in this film, but also in Chacun cherche son chat and Peut-être. Like Altman, Klapisch explores plural narratives, and as Kieślowski did in Rouge, Klapisch uses flashes of the color red to trace a fil rouge, or unifying theme, throughout this film, tying the color with the notion of the heart in various ways. Paris received largely favorable comments when it opened in France, but several critics complained that it contained too many characters and that the narrative arc for each character was insufficient. Some secondary characters only barely glimpsed, while others received more in-depth treatment. My response is that the film is less about one character than it is about the city and the variety of people who inhabit it, thus its title, Paris. And while it's true that some of the characters' longer storylines were cut and modified during the editing process, the film still clearly tries to show the breadth and depth of potential connections and lack of connections that take place in any metropolis. Community has always been Klapisch's focus, but the community in each of his films is given specific boundaries, from a department store in his first film, to a high school, to a family, to a specific neighborhood of Paris, to a small group of thieves, to Paris of the future, to Europe, then to extending Europe to include Russia, and now in this film to the whole of Paris, including a bit of footage filmed in Cameroon to trace one character's journey to France. Film critic and author René Prédal, in his book Le cinéma français depuis 2000, has noted that Paris is, and I'll paraphrase again, a brilliant film, easy to watch, but with an exasperating superficiality where nothing is said. I respectfully disagree with Prédal, as I believe that the film paints in a variety of ways the human and often touching plight of solitary souls in search of meaningful connections. Klapisch is an existentialist who cares about existence. Some film critics consider Klapisch's films as light fare that can be easily dismissed, perhaps because they appeal to a large population and offer generally positive messages. But I would respond that community is a universal subject, that existence is a fairly weighty notion that we all grapple with again and again as we pursue the various bounds and bonds of relationships between family members, friends, or just those with whom we inhabit any given geographical space. A number of French and European directors have probed the fragmentation that modern society seems to display, looking at the tensions that spring from immigration and resettlement, nationalistic sentiment, union with a larger whole. Kieślowski, the Polish writer-director who made his last films in France, and Michael Haneke, the German-Austrian director, who too has made French films, and many French directors have all looked at contemporary France and a host of social problems as a locus and a focus for their films. Klapisch often looks at the same issues, how they affect one small community and have bearing on a larger scale as well. However, his stance is by and large optimistic. Klapisch recalls that he and his classmate at NYU, Todd Hollins, often discussed their different outlooks and the resulting films that stem from their positions, Klapisch is positive and Hollins negative. I believe that we can observe in Paris what Georgina Evans observes about Haneke and Kieślowski, who track, and I quote, a diversity of individual lines of attention where characters are united on the visual plane of the frame, but who are absorbed in very different processes. In Paris, the lack of connections, or the connections, as you look at it, between characters is certainly one of the more interesting elements of the film. We have Pierre, a young dancer with a heart condition, and his sister, a single mother of 3, who devotes her time to helping her brother. Another set of siblings posits the history professor Romain, who falls for one of his students, side by side with his brother Philippe, an architect, with a young wife expecting a child. We also encounter characters who work in the outdoor markets, and in particular one couple who has separated. A bakery shop owner and her apprentice, a homeless man, some fashion models, and an immigrant who arrives from Africa to join his brother's family. As with most of Klapisch's films, the different characters and different groups or sets of characters allow us to see different perspectives, and each small group has its own milieu, its own type of discourse and habits. When these characters cross paths, we see all the ways in which the connections and tensions that each individual holds can also open up points of potential interaction, sometimes transitory and sometimes more permanent with others. When I met with Cédric Klapisch in Paris in 2006, he was still working on the story that would become Paris. He had just returned from the Cannes Film Festival that May, where he had seen and been intrigued by Iñárritu's film Babel with its plural storylines. During our conversation, Klapisch told me about a recent trip he had taken to New York, where from his hotel window high above Central Park, he had had a flash vision about a film in Paris where different characters would be able to glimpse each other from various vantage points of the city, such as the Eiffel Tower, Montmartre, the Montparnasse Tower, the Butte Chaumont. While that proposed narrative subsequently evolved into a much more complex story in Paris, we can still see seeds of this idea in a film that includes different sectors of Paris, which are connected through a broader geography as well as through some parallel concerns. In Paris, the characters' stories are not interlocking. Some are unaware that the others exist, but we see them all and we make the connections, seeing their parallels, the differences between their individual struggles, comparing and contrasting them, and relying, as Klapisch does, on established entities or units, such as family relationships, birth and death, individuals and communities, to examine all the ways in which connections are both preserved and perverted by these entities. As you watch the film, contemplate the ways in which the characters are linked, as siblings or as neighbors, or in sharing struggles. Notice how and when they cross or almost cross paths, and when they miss or fail to see each other. Contemplate too how the various pairings allow us to see contrasts and comparisons between fixed units, such as brother and sister, professor and student, architect and historian, vendor and customer, as well as the many references to the old and the new, the past and the present, that are part of the city of Paris. Throughout the stories, we understand that the characters' various emotional heartaches mirror Pierre's physical heart malady. We also note that Pierre's ailment parallels the city of Paris in some way, just as his character mimics, in part, Klapisch's job as a writer-director. Because of his illness, Pierre watches from his balcony and imagines histories and stories for those he sees. Pierre needs a heart transplant. The city of Paris has shown its ability to renew itself through the preservation of its history and traditions, and equally through its assimilation of transplanted individuals who come from other locations to become part of the community of Paris. Paris remains Paris because of its traditions and because of its innovation, a process that Klapisch finds even in small details, such as the choice of a baguette as une tradition or une normale. Paris is Paris, Klapisch would argue, because of the variety that it contains. In one scene from this film, where a television series about the city of Paris is being made, the commentator calls Paris the land of 1,000 faces. In another scene, a character dances to Wilson Pickett's Land of 1,000 Dances. And in another moment, a history professor quotes the poet Baudelaire's words that his work is without tail or head, a modern, and by implication non-linear, form of poetry that results from contact with large cities and their countless connections. In many respects, Klapisch's film Paris offers a multitude of pieces where there is no single means of cracking its shell to find what's inside, or to pinpoint where each individual narration begins or will end. The story becomes deeper with each viewing as small details emerge and various connections or coincidences are more fully realized. I'll be interested in hearing your thoughts and comments, and I encourage you, just as the history professor in this film encourages his viewers, to try to discover, in the fragments, Baudelaire's vision, and I believe Klapisch's too, of order, beauty, splendor, peace, and pleasure. Thank you.